What's up YouTube? I'm an average dad, and recently I purchased this, an old 2006 Audi S4, because the channel's doing pretty well these days. Fun fact is it's one of the only car models ever made that has 4 doors, all-wheel drive, a V8, and a manual transmission. But yeah, first generation Audi owner. My parents are pretty proud.
I'm really proud of you.
No, they actually thought it was a really questionable decision to buy a high mileage out of warranty Audi, but what do parents know? A little bit more about the car. I obviously got a spicy hot deal, paid almost nothing. There was a bunch of problems wrong with it. I had a shop fix a lot of the major ones, and I'm gonna try to DIY the rest of them. So today we're gonna start that with changing the brake pads, rotors, and painting the calipers. Not exactly sure how much of the brake pads are left, but there is a squealing sound when I drive slow, so I think it's brake related. The rotors are really rusty, so I wanna change those. And I mean, obviously the red caliper paint is performance related, so. All right, let's get to it. So first things first, I gotta take off the wheels. I'll crack the lug nuts while the car is still on the ground so the weight of the car keeps the wheels from spinning. And during this, it's important to follow the lefty-loosey, righty does not loosen rule. My breaker bar is pretty short, so I grabbed something from the garage to extend it, but turns out it was a curtain rod and bent pretty quickly. After that, I wised up though and used my jack handle, but found out that the 3/8 inch breaker bar I was using was not up to the task, as here you can see the ball bearing falls out, as one of the forks was bent significantly outward. At this point, I was pretty frustrated. Thought about using my socket wrench, but realized that would probably break too. Decided to spray some WD-40, slept on it, and the next day spent big money on a larger breaker bar. Needless to say, my wife was pumped that none of the wheels were off and we are already buying new tools for this project. But once the car's up in the air, I'll go ahead and take the lug nuts off, going in a star pattern to remove them, and then start prepping the calipers for paint. To do this, I used a cut brush attached to my cordless drill. This wrecked the battery though, so on the other side, I borrowed my neighbor's corded drill, which worked much better. After each caliper is cleaned off with the cut brush, I'll go ahead and wipe it down with isopropanol alcohol so that it is clean and ready for paint. Even though I am changing the rotors, I'll go ahead and cover the rotor and then as much of the wheel well in the car as I can to protect it from overspray. So for painting, I'm going to follow the lead of a couple other large YouTubers and start with a metal primer and then move on to the red caliper paint. So I'll go ahead and do 3 coats of that primer and make sure the piston area is all taped off beforehand. After the primer's all done, I'll go ahead and move on to the red caliper paint. I'll start with thin coats and progressively move on to thicker coats with 3 total. Once that's done, I'll go ahead and remove all the plastic, and it looks pretty good. So now I just need to replace the rotor and the brake pads on the front. So I'll remove the 2 guide pins holding the caliper onto the caliper bracket and unplug the brake pad sensor. So the paint is supposed to fully harden, I think in 2 to 3 days. So this went very poorly, trying to remove this spring clip that keeps the brake pads from rattling after it only dried about an hour. And that is why you wear safety glasses. After that's off, I can remove the caliper from the rotor. You can see one of the brake pads falls out and the other one is attached to that sensor wire. To hold the caliper while I'm working, I originally tried to use zip ties, which ended up being a terrible idea because here on the other side you can see it broke, and I was extremely lucky to not have a brake line leak and resulting from that. So I'll remove the safety screw, but then the only way to get the rotor off the front is to remove the caliper bracket. So I'll do that and the rotor will come right off. So you can see the old one was protected pretty well from the red paint, but still got a little bit on there. So I'll go ahead and hit the rotor with some brake cleaner to make sure all the manufacturing oils are off of it, and then clean the hub so that the rotor doesn't get stuck to it using some brake lubricant. Then I'll be ready to put the new rotor on. When that's on, I can put the caliper bracket back on, and then I can lube up the brake pads and put those in their spots. Before I reinstall the caliper onto the caliper bracket, I'll make sure to clean these guide pins and re-lubricate them. The guide pins go into blind holes, so it's really difficult to tell whether or not they lined up with the threaded portion of the caliper bracket. So you'll see I'll have to jiggle it around quite a bit to make sure those are seated before I screw them in. Once those are pretty tight, I'll make sure to torque them to spec with a torque wrench. It'll break away and make a clicking sound when they're as tight as they're supposed to be. Getting the spring clip back on was a giant headache, so I actually turned off the video because it took me so long to get it right. But you can see I did scratch a bunch of the paint off in that process. So to fix this, I sprayed some of the paint into a cup and then used a brush to quickly touch up those surfaces. So now for a more expensive mistake.
I declare
On the driver's side, I didn't align the bottom guide pin with the caliper bracket well. Since the guide pin is a lot harder than the caliper bracket and I forced it with my socket wrench, I ended up cross-threading the caliper bracket. This basically just means I messed up the threads and made it so the bracket was useless. So as you can see here, one of the guide pins screws in easily and the other one is kind of crooked and does not screw in all the way. And while this caliper bracket would be probably $30 part for a Toyota, since it's an Audi, they wanted $400. Fortunately, I found one that looked like it had never been installed on a car, but was being sold for $60 on a used parts site. So I'll move on to the rear wheels and we'll check back with this at the end. For the rear wheels, it's going to be pretty similar, but actually a little bit easier. Most of the braking power comes from the front wheels, so these back calipers are smaller and a little bit easier to work with. So just like the front, we'll prep the calipers for paint. I only did 1 coat of primer instead of 3. I was a little nervous about the max temperature of the primer being a lot lower than the caliper paint, so I just wanted to go with 1 on the rears and see how it went. After the paint's done, it'll be time to remove the calipers. These have 2 guide pins that are a lot easier to see from the side. Once those are removed, I'll carefully slide the caliper off, being very delicate as to not hurt the brake line. Then I can remove the brake pads. The outer one had a lot of tread left on it, looked fine. The inner one though, actually the wear material had separated from the pad backing. I think this was causing the screeching sound that I noticed earlier when driving in parking garages. On the rear, I didn't have to take off the caliper bracket to remove the rotor, but it was really tight. I had to loosen the top bracket bolt in order to slide the new rotors in. Once they're on, I could clean and re-lubricate the guide pins and then place the anti-rattle hardware, which is a lot easier to install on the rear, and the brake pads. So a mistake I made on the fronts is I didn't open the brake fluid reservoir under the hood, which made it really hard to compress the calipers before I put them back onto the new rotors. And the reservoir was also super full, so I ended up leaking some brake fluid under the engine. I originally freaked out because I thought it was oil, but eventually figured out it was just brake fluid. So here for the rears, I'm going to go ahead and open that reservoir and put a shirt around it so it doesn't leak over or down around the engine. So after breaking 2 of my neighbor's C-clamps, compressing the calipers on the front, which did not show in video, I forgot to tape that, ended up buying the tool that was meant to do that on the rears and made it really easy to compress those so they slide onto the new rotors and brake pads. Next, I could torque those to spec and then reinstall the rear wheels. So only 4 days after the project began, I am finally done with the rear wheels and the new bracket for the front wheel came in. Fortunately, it is in great condition and looks just like the old one that I cross-threaded, so we'll go ahead and get it painted and put it in the car. This time I'll be extremely careful lining up the guide pins with the threaded portions of the caliper bracket to make sure I don't make the same mistake twice. And then for this tire, I let the camera roll while I put the spring clip on the brake pads, and so you can see how successful I was at that. So after a week, this project is finally done. For costs, I paid $390 for the brake kit, the rotors and brake pads, and then about $9 each for the primer and caliper paint. So that puts the total at just a little over $400. If I took this to a shop and had the brakes done and the calipers painted, I'm guessing it would have been around $1,000. So still a pretty good deal. All right, let's take a look at the before and after. Hey, if you're still watching, thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed it. Please consider liking or subscribing. See ya.